this next session as a somewhat split panel. The first 15 minutes or so, I'm going to bring up on stage now James Fiddling, who's President and Chief Operating Officer of the Dow Chemical Company, and Jan Sigmund, who's Corporate Vice President and CFO at ADP, if they come and join me on stage. We're going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'm going to bring up two further panelists, Victoria Kolakowski and Mary Benato, who are both coming from the legal side of things to interact about what needs to be done and where the potential for business to make a difference is. So this first session is really looking from the perspective of two very senior corporate executives about the business case for LGBT inclusion and what that case really is. And I'm going to start with you, Jim. I mean, and we'll start with your personal stories, actually. I mean, because you've only recently come out as a gay man late in your career, having spent a lot of your time, I guess, sort of below the radar in that sense. Why did you decide to come out, and what does that experience tell you about the economic case for inclusion?
Well, I've been 32 years with Dow, and I spent quite a bit of that time overseas. I spent about 11 years in Asia, and it was really the end of 2013 that I came out to my immediate staff, the leadership team at Dow, and that was after a pretty serious battle with some health issues. And I made a decision during that time that I needed to remove some stresses from my life, and this was one of them that I decided to remove. And then I came out publicly to the whole employee population at an out event that we had, our LGBT resource group had in October, Coming Out Day. And that was a global webcast to the entire Dow population. And I had a lot of support from some folks in this room and my CEO and our CFO, who is the sponsor of the LGBT network. And the response from Dow people was overwhelmingly supportive, and to the tune of not one negative message from the Dow population. And anybody that uses the phrase, you feel like a giant weight has been lifted off your shoulder, you physically feel like that has happened. And I know many people in this room feel that same way. But it made a big difference in my work. It made a big difference in how I was able to do things at work and in my productivity. And I think productivity is one of the main things that we look at in the business case. There are many studies that have been done about employees being 30% more productive because they're able to bring their whole selves to work, or teams being able to be more collaborative because teams with a more inclusive membership, including openly gay and lesbian members on the teams, can perform a lot of skills 30-40% better than a team that's non-diverse. We see that, and I feel that in my work. So I look back now, I don't regret doing what I did or how I came out, but I am very happy that I did it, and
but I mean, it's interesting, I mean, because obviously you've reached the very highest levels at Dow, without having, whilst carrying that weight on your shoulder. And I mean, do you ever wonder whether maybe that was something that drove you to perform more successfully at work in some ways? I mean, I think we all broadly accept the diversity argument.
I think
brings people up.
I think I was born in the 60s. I grew up my childhood, the 60s and the 70s, 80s. It was a different time frame. And during that time frame, I think what I wanted more than anything was that my work should speak for itself. And I didn't want to be judged in a negative way from being labeled gay. I wasn't afraid. I mean, I've had friends for many, many years that knew, although I wasn't out publicly at work. But at the same time, when I looked at it, I was reaching a level in my career where I wasn't going to have a choice. My life was so public, and I wanted to be in control of making myself more open to the employees and to people I do business with. And I decided to do that on my own terms. So I don't regret that I decided to come out that way.
Did you find people were surprised, any of the people that knew you well, or?
Oh, I don't know if surprised. Maybe the greatest secret never told. I don't know if that's, if it was surprise or not. I felt overwhelming support. I never made that the main focus of my work life. But the penalty is trying to lead separate lives. I mean, you try to lead a work life that's very separate from your personal life, and you can do that, but I will tell you that it takes a toll. And I think it takes a toll on both of them.
Yeah, and you've taken the opposite path in a way. I mean, you've been out throughout your entire professional career.
That's correct. Actually, I was probably out at work before I was out to my friends in a way, and joined ADP 16 years ago. And during my interview with then the CEO of ADP, I got outed with the classic question of how is your wife doing? And the answer was, we can't marry in this country, and it would be a man. And throughout my career, I've been always out. And in the sense, I echo what Jim is saying. Once you're out, as we all know in this room, a big burden lifts off your shoulders. And throughout my career, I think I tried to make it actually more of an asset than a liability. And it probably contributed in many ways to what success I have achieved in my personal path by being more sensitive, by being more intuitive in political situations, by being authentic to the teams that I had to lead, by being hopefully more open-minded, although the German thing sometimes works against that. But so in a way, for me, the being out and gay has turned out to be a supporting factor. Now you had to overcome a little bit out of adversity and education because, like Jim, we're the other generation, the older generation here, and so you had to work a little bit with your boards and with your executive committee members to educate. So it was less, I think, prejudice in discrimination, but ignorance that you had to overcome. And by being an example and by sensitizing topics, I think I could add something, broaden the discussion, make the company a little bit more inclusive, and I think that has helped overall my career path, I would say.
So both of you being senior executives, I mean, I hear quite a lot that things like you did with the company-wide webcast and so forth, that having that visible leader at the top who is very out to the entire company, adds something that just simply being out to close colleagues wouldn't do. And have you noticed that effect within the company?
I think that's true. I mean, I think in the business world today, we're moving past just a drive for profits. There's a whole emphasis towards conscious capitalism, and that means authentic leadership is a part of that. And so I think my ability to be a leader by being more authentic with the employees has opened up a dialogue that wasn't there before, and let some walls have come down. At the same time, I'll tell you, when I had the global webcast with the Dow population, Dow's got about 49,000 people around the world. When I had that global webcast, we hit a couple of milestones after that webcast. There were almost 780 new members to our LGBT resource group. Our LGBT,
overnight, more or less. Yeah.
In that time frame, right. Our LGBT resource group is the largest of our 7 resource groups in the company.
And by resource group, you mean?
Our African American network, our women's network, our diversity networks. And that group grew tremendously after that webcast. And we also hit another milestone, which was 50% of our global leaders, our top 250 leaders around the world, 50% became allies. 75% of our LGBT resource group are allies. And 50% of our global leaders are allies.
And by ally, you mean specifically?
They mean they're visibly and openly supporting LGBT diversity in the workplace at Dow. And they are...
That's something you sign up to, isn't it?
They sign up, but they're active participants in the network. They attend events. They display their allegiance to the employees so that there's a safe place for employees to talk to global leaders. And our target really is to try to get that global leader population number to 100% being allies. And that makes a big difference in the organization.
Well, it must be now sending a signal if you're not an ally, is it, in some way? Or?
Well, I don't think in a threatening way. I think what we want to try to do to get 100% of the leaders to be an ally is just a sincere request. And I think if an authentic leader like myself, I hope I am, can make a sincere request of them to be part of that group, then I think we'll be able to achieve that goal.
I want to comment, it might be slightly controversial to say. I also believe that senior leadership committing to the LGBT issues is important. Being out as a senior executive is important. And to have, of course, the right policy and regulatory framework in place is foundational. But even if you do all of that, it is no guarantee that the enterprise becomes an inclusive and thriving workplace, because we might be doing the dancing on the big global webcast and sending the right signals. You can still discover in the depth of organizations pockets of homophobia and young associates that are 7 layers away from the corner office are really kind of affected in their decisions, I think, in a much more direct way of how the local workplace works, how the local manager is including them, and how they observe micro inequities. There's this famous statistics: you're 80% less likely to be out at work if your direct manager makes a homophobic comment. So that, I find, is the big challenge in driving true inclusiveness for a large corporation, because at ADP, we have set in place all these things, 100%. At the Human Rights Campaign, we have 2 executive members, actually, of our executive teams are LGBT, and we're an HR company. We believe in this stuff, but to really drive down and find good tools to be inclusive at the management level, I think is a very hard challenge. And now comes the controversial part. I find that maybe the LGBT community becomes a little bit a victim of the achievements that we all have, because we are so fully integrated, in particular metropolitan areas, that fight of coming out and that energy of fighting for the right thing that was a key driver for me in the mid-90s to contribute, I think is today not as relevant. So if you're an integrated millennial in the big metropolitan area, you may not find that the employee resource group is the first thing that you want to be part of. And unless broad swaths of the enterprise are out and setting examples on a micro basis every day, I think it becomes harder. So I think there is this element of LGBT community members having still a big obligation and opportunity to drive this, even though maybe companies set at the executive level the right framework. There's still much, much more work to be done, I think.
So as I understand the literature on this, there are 3 main ways in which being an inclusive company really works economically for the advantage of the business. One is you can recruit from the full pool of people more effectively, so you get the best talent. Second, for the reasons like you say, the weight from your shoulders is removed, people are more creative when they can bring their whole self to work, so you get more productivity from your workers. And thirdly, from a consumer perspective, you have people in the company that see the market opportunities where there's a growing marketplace of buyers who are LGBT people and who want to buy from companies that respect who they are as people. Now, for each of your companies, how do you weigh up the benefits that you're getting, or the opportunities, the scale of each of those opportunities?
Well, talent is big. Today, Dow's employee population around the world is 1/3 millennials. 75% of millennials believe in same-sex marriage. 80% of them will put their values on how companies treat have diverse policies and treat employees at the top of making a decision about where they come to work. So that's very big. We can't recruit the best and the brightest without it. And then second for us, I would say, is innovation. Innovation, about 40% of our sales and margins come from new products that we've introduced in the last 5 years. So without the best and brightest, you don't have the right innovative minds in the room. And without teams that can collaborate with our customers to create new solutions, my view is that those diverse teams are more open-minded, and the way that they solve problems and the way that they attack issues with customers are very different than a homogeneous team that's a little more biased and maybe blindered and a little bit closed-minded about how they approach things. I think we see that come through right in the bottom line from innovation and higher margin sales.
Jan?
For ADP, as an HR company, it's kind of logical to be inclusive and trying to be a role model, I think, about inclusiveness and diversity. And talent reigns first. Clearly, I would agree with Jim, and the good things that come from a more diverse workforce. One factor that I found and I had learned lately, I think the indirect effects that an active LGBT community has on the broader employee population is not to be underestimated. As Jim mentioned, about half of our employee resource group, ADP Pride, are allies. And surprisingly, all my direct reports are also allies and or LGBT. So the part of the signal that an inclusive work environment sends to so many of our straight allies is not to be underestimated, because those allies and those straight people observe very keenly, and everybody is special in their own way, you know. And by doing something and being out and supporting that has still a lot of stigma in many parts of the world, I think we're sending a signal for other people it's a great workplace. And so this morning we heard this example about Asian women flocking to the gay recruiting desk, and I would fully subscribe to that theory. And so we started to focus really as an ADP Pride team for much more active engagement of our straight allies with webinars and information around problems that straight allies face relative to the LGBT community.
So one last question briefly before I bring up the other two panelists. We ran a Schumpeter column in The Economist a few weeks ago on diversity fatigue, and this concern that, you know, there's people are just feeling that they understand the case. I think the REIU research actually picked this up as well. People recognize the case for inclusion and so forth, but they just are worn out by all these constant HR initiatives and all those sorts of things, and they feel it's not really worth prioritizing for spending and so forth. I mean, what's your answer to that? Have you found ways to ensure you don't suffer from diversity fatigue?
It's, you know, I think it's a real situation. We've been on this journey for a while. Our journey on diversity started 25 years ago with gender diversity, and it's continued from that point. We make progress every year. The progress isn't as fast as we would like it, so I don't think there will ever be a time where we are not putting diversity out as a target for the company. We continue to put more money into training, unconscious bias training, other kinds of training to create the right environment. I think the other thing that happens is a lot of times when people see people get to a certain level and then maybe somebody fails in the organization and it's a diverse candidate, they typically tend to go to a space where they say, well, diversity didn't help us out. Diversity didn't bring us the right candidate. And I think they miss the fact that sometimes in an organization, it's skills that cause somebody to lose that job, not diversity. And we can't let people use diversity in that way to fight against the drive that we have to increase the diversity. The way we treat each other and the way we treat customers are very, very highly linked. And every business, every study has ever shown this. And all we're trying to do with diversity is create an environment where the way we treat others is the way that we want to be treated.
Jan, anything to add?
Completely agree. I think if it's a message of that the individual counts and that you can grow and prosper with your own uniqueness is the way to go, rather than to make it a subsidization of special interest groups, which can be tiring, I think. But that individual message of opportunity, I think, is never getting tired. Not to me, at least.
Great. Well, I'd love to invite our other two panelists up on stage, Mary Bonato and Victoria Kolakowski. And what we're going to do briefly here is I'm going to ask both of our new panelists a bit about how they see the situation specifically in America. Where is the state of play? We've had the right to marry, which Mary was actually argued the case for in front of the Supreme Court. So great hero of the movement here. I want to get a sense, and Victoria is a leading judge and a transgender woman, and has some particular perspectives on the transgender challenges as well, which we haven't really talked about a lot today, but I think are, in a sense, the litmus test of where we're heading. So both of you, and then we're going to come back and bring in our two business executives to talk a bit about how business and other activists and the legal system and everything can work together to keep momentum going over the next few years. So, Mary, first of all, I mean, where are we? How far? What are the big challenges you're wrestling with now, having hopefully secured marriage equality? I don't know whether you felt you were convinced by Margaret Hoover this morning and thinking that this can't be reversed, but...
Well, there's no doubt, and thank you to everybody in the room who's helped to contribute to these victories. There's no doubt we've made tremendous progress. You know, we have 4 Supreme Court decisions in the last 20 years, each time saying, stop treating gay people differently from everyone else, and then same-sex couples too. And so now we can share in this fundamental right that belongs to all Americans. We have the equal right to join in this, incredible social and legal institution. However, that's never been the end of the road. It was just simply there was this governmental exclusion that was wrong, and we fixed that. And what we're seeing now is, and this happens in every movement, in every legal social justice movement, what you see is you achieve a signal victory, and you deal with the counter movement, which is remobilized to fight you. And so, for example, right now, I mean, there were references, I think, by a couple of people this morning about how, you know, the whole phenomenon of you can get married on Friday and fired on Monday, because we have fewer than half the states with non-discrimination laws. We have no national non-discrimination law, despite efforts to pass one since the 1970s. So people are not protected, and that's a problem. And then the other issue is the piling on. So I'd lost count, I admit, but I'd lost count at 180 bad bills in the states to basically reinvigorate the kinds of discrimination in which people can engage and to give them ideas about how they might want to discriminate in their states. So it's everything from government clerks who are supposed to serve everybody, who would now get a legislative pass to say, well, actually, you don't have to. That's the government treating people differently just because of who they are.
And you were just saying earlier, before we came on, about the Kansas City case. Perhaps you could tell.
Kentucky.
Kansas City?
Kentucky.
Sorry.
Kentucky, yes.
Kentucky, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows of Kim Davis, the clerk in Rowan County, Kentucky, who, made a stand. This legal organization trolled the whole country till they found her, and they found her. So she's made her stand. And here's the thing, there's fatigue about this too. I mean, I think there's fatigue in the sense that, in this latest iteration, when our allies at the ACLU, who've done a great job, went to court to say, you can't issue different forms, she should really be, issuing licenses too. The judge said, the licenses are getting issued, the forms are not a big deal. It is a big deal, unfortunately, even though it comes out in something little like forms. When you start saying, we're going to start nicking and cutting at the rights that you have, the equality rights that you have, because it just keeps growing. It's not an accommodation that makes people back off. History is a lesson in that regard. I mean, let me just ask you this. Do you ever think that Planned Parenthood thought it would be where it is today after Roe versus Wade? I mean, if you think about just the kinds of, one restriction after another, that I think is what is being engineered right now and has been engineered for a couple of years. And I actually want to seg to business really soon if I can, because I think business has been and can be an incredibly productive player.
We'll come on and do that a bit in a moment or two, but I just want to push you in. Do you share the optimism we heard this morning about the Supreme Court? Yes.
I hope so. I mean, to put it this way, I feel like it's for all of us is to be, as innocent as doves and wise as serpents, that whole thing. Like, in other words, plan for the worst, believe in the best. And so in that vein, how can I help but worry? There was this whole campaign for close to 50 years to gut the Voting Rights Act, signal achievement of the civil rights movement. And in 2013, the day before the Supreme Court decided United States versus Windsor, the day before that, there was a real death blow delivered to the Voting Rights Act, not to gut it entirely, but to take away its major enforcement provision. Do I feel like that kind of thing is possible? I think it is the kind of thing we have to be extremely concerned about, and that's why, again, I want business involved, because when you start thinking about this narrative of equivalence, religious liberty and non-discrimination and so on, here's the thing. I mean, religious liberty, it's been around, we all believe in it. We value religious liberty in this country. You have an absolute absolute right to believe what you believe. But the problem comes in when you want to act on those beliefs. And you don't have absolute freedom of action, particularly when it's going to involve harming other people. And when you start talking about discrimination, you're harming other people. When you're talking about the government, or taxpayer dollars, by the way, which is another form of government, then I'm sorry, the government's supposed to be available to all comers on equal terms. So I feel like it's a false equivalence, and we really need to shoot this down, just like it was shot down after the Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and you're gonna love this case name, the South Carolina barbecue franchise named Piggy Park said, it's against God's will for me to serve African Americans. And the court smacked him down and said, of course you're entitled to believe what you want, but again, your conduct has to conform with the constitutional rights and protections afforded to all of our citizens. So I see that conflict brewing, and I'm very conscious of having lived through all the marriage thing, where first it was statutes, and then it was passing constitutional amendments, and what I'm seeing is concerning, and I think we have to react not with like, oh my God, everything bad is going to happen, but to be on it so that bad things don't happen, or else we are going to be in a position where we're undoing damage for the next several decades, and I don't think that has to happen.
Now, Victoria, one of the instances I mentioned this morning where a local law, non-discrimination law, was struck down by a political campaign was in Houston, where basically transgender people became the target of the campaigns, particularly the access to bathrooms and things. Can you just give us a sense of where you see the debate around transgender and how this fits into the overall challenge that people wanting to promote LGBT inclusion face?
Absolutely. I just want to give one quick I want to do my quick caveat right now, is because everybody knows now that I'm a judge. Nothing that I'm saying is meant to indicate how I or any other judge would rule on any specific issue, and I'm not here in any way advocating, because after all we know, and I'm not an activist, because after all we know that activist judges are bad things. And so, with regard to bathrooms, this is a fundamental issue I think that we are facing right now. For those of you who don't know, there are bills popping up in a variety of states that would limit the access of people to use bathrooms of their gender identity. For example, they're saying whatever you were born with basically is where you need to go, to the point where some are even suggesting visual checks or even DNA testing for being given access to bathrooms, to other gender differentiated spaces. And one of the things that's hard for us is that going to the bathroom is non-optional. It's not something that you can say, well, just don't do it, because unfortunately, that doesn't work. And this is actually from the point of view of businesses. If your business has not faced the question of what to do about bathrooms, it means you probably haven't had somebody transition yet, but you will, because it's the first thing that business gets faced with. Is like, where do you go to the bathroom? It's the first thing that was, I transitioned in my final semester in law school. It was the first big challenge the law school faced was where would I go to the bathroom? And which they decided that they would give me my own bathroom. Well, actually, no, they gave me a key to the Chancellor private bathroom, but he stopped using it while I was there. And so, but this is very difficult. It's a very challenging thing for us, because what's happening now is that we're being used as a wedge issue to try to, for example, in Houston, the Equal Rights Ordinance there, it was the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance HERO, was actually covered a variety of different groups, but we were used as the wedge issue to defeat at the ballot box, because the argument that's being made is that basically men are going to be going into the ladies' room and molesting your little girls, And truthfully, a lot of the guys I know, the female to male transgender folks, you wouldn't want them going into the ladies' room because they've got beards and they look, they're very masculine looking guys. They'd probably get arrested or killed if they did that. No, but they really, I sometimes wonder where they really want us to go. And I know the answer to that is away. The answer is they want us to go away. And, but it's a fundamental problem for us because you can't, if we're going to be authentic ourselves, then we can't present as one thing and then say, it'd be hard for me to go into a men's room. I mean, it would be ludicrous. And for female to male transgender people, it would be, as I just said, even more ridiculous.
So very quickly, Jan and Jim, how are your companies addressing transgender people at the moment?
I was just like, oh, please.
Go ahead, Anand.
I was listening, fascinating, because, and this morning I think we heard about the inclusion of transgender benefit as one of the later additions to the HRC survey. And I was lucky to be part of our executive committee at that point in time. And I was so thankful for that inclusion in that survey because it triggered basically the need to discuss the topic. Mm-hmm. And of course, complete ignorance in the boardroom about the needs and some smirky smiles. And it was really a fantastic education lesson for our executive committee just to discuss the topics and the needs for medical coverage to the more logistical needs. And it, I think, helped overall insight into important issues that minorities can face, often unobserved. So again, a topic of ignorance that allowed us to bring it to the forefront, and then we were of course delighted to comply and go the extra mile for it. But it played a very important role, I think, to take our awareness in the company forward and allow discussions of unusual topic, and demonstrate that we're serious about these things and there is no time for joking or for ignorance around it. And I think we took good advantage of that as a company, and it made a big difference for the overall LGBT community to have that discussion.
We've been happy to be part of the HRC, the CEI index for the last decade, and scored 100% on that index for that period of time. So we've been through this journey of bringing on transgender and a reassignment healthcare provisions for our employees. We haven't had any issues with the bathroom situation, and I hope we don't, because I think we have a culture that would be able to deal with that. And we have had reassignments in the company, so we have had situations like that. But I think now it's just an accepted part of what we do at work.
Victoria?
I do want to say, though, that one of the things that is a challenge for the transgender community is we are a chronically unemployed and underemployed community. We have a difficult time breaking in, even in more accepting and forward-thinking business communities, particularly when you get outside of, for example, where I come from in the Bay Area, programmers and engineers and people who skateboard around and roller skate through the office and have multiple piercings and all. Transgender people get those sorts of jobs. But jobs like as in the general counsel's office or in the CFO's office, accountants and lawyers, we have a lot more difficulty breaking through. And if somebody transitions, very often wind up as unemployed or underemployed, having to find some other position outside of the corporate world, simply because I think that there's a stigma that's attached to transgender people that isn't to lesbian and gay folks, which is, I think that the problem that people have with lesbian and gay people is one of believing that somehow we're, as a lesbian also, I can say, as being somewhat immoral, or they object to on some religious or theological basis. With transgender people, they just think we're nuts. They think that we are fundamentally delusional and out of touch with reality. And as a result of that, we're not the sort of people that you want interacting with your shareholders, that you don't want interacting with key stakeholders. And so in places where we're not going to interact with people where you expect the responsible adults in the room to be, there's been some progress, but there's still a lot of room that we need to make in terms of transgender folks coming into these other positions. And a lot of folks who are successful, who are transgender, never talk about it. They are fairly what we in our community talk about stealth, which is our fancy word for closet, which is saying, you know, I'm a woman now or I'm a man now, and I'm not going to talk about that anymore. And so I want to point this out because I know we've been having a lot of this sort of really feel good about how far we've come with lesbian and gay inclusion and moving forward. In the transgender community, we still have a long way to go. And for the folks who are worried about that there's not enough to do, you can move that energy into trans inclusion, and you'll still have a lot of opportunities. And so, anyway.
Very well said. Mary, now your moment. What do you want to see from the business community? How can they help in America over the next year or two?
Well, I have been very cheered by the response to bills like those that have been proposed in Arizona and Indiana. I know the business community is mobilizing to some degree around some of these bills now. But I guess when I think about I'm going to assume that we all share this idea that equal treatment as a norm is a really good thing. You know, people have talked very eloquently all day about how it makes such a difference with the policies, and when you drill down on the policies and create a accepting climate, how people, you know, are more productive and, you know, flower and creative. Well, think about that on a cultural level. So how do we establish non-discrimination as a norm? And I will say two things. I mean, I do think there has to be just more engagement with the Congress. And, you know, a lot of these companies, you have lobbyists. You know, and this has got to get on the agenda and be part of the team, I think, with some of the other advocacy organizations, because we're not going to get a non-discrimination norm without that kind of muscle. And this voice is critical.
The Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, which are both, you know, massively influential in Washington, have increased their influence over the past few years. I mean, I get the impression LGBT inclusion is not high on their agenda, and yet they are the...
I haven't heard about them as an ally. I didn't see them as... I mean, again, maybe they are. Maybe people in this room can stand up later and talk more about that. But when I think about the massive efforts in the litigation involving the Defense of Marriage Act and then also marriage itself, where first we had 270-some companies at the Supreme Court and then 379 last year this time, you know, we didn't have those organizations. So anyway, I do think there just needs to be much more of an effort. And again, when you think about where somebody's headquartered and then therefore being able to make a much more persuasive case, that's one piece. But the second thing is the road to equality as a norm also is paved through the states. And that's on two fronts. One is trying to enact non-discrimination laws, you know, to spur the kinds of things that were spurred for you through the Corporate Equality Index. To make companies re-examine their policies and what are we going to do here? I mean, we don't want somebody to approach us and say, I'm transitioning, what should I do? Like, you want to have your policy in place before that conversation happens.
It was interesting. I mean, we wrote a bit about the Houston situation where clearly there are a number of companies there. I think Shell was identified as one that gets 100 score on the Human Rights Campaign Index and yet seemed to not be making any noise about what was going on in its own city on this issue. And I mean, is there a sense in which companies are actually better at the national and international level and not so good at the state level? Jim, you wanted to jump in.
Well, in the Houston situation, we were very vocal. Our site leader in Freeport, Texas, really led the charge with op-eds in the paper. We were very vocal about our support for the policies in Houston. We have a lot of employees in the Houston Freeport region. It's our largest manufacturing facility in the world. And it was very disappointed when we didn't win that, but it wasn't, I don't think our employees...
Did you feel all the other corporations were playing their
You know,
role?
we made a lot of phone calls. I had support from BP. I think we had some support there from Chevron. We had some noticeably absent support in the business community. Most industry associations are not going to step up because one member comes up and says, you should step up against, the chamber should step up and support LGBT rights. But individual business leads can make a difference. When the situation came up in Indiana, when Governor Pence, when we had the Religious Freedom Restoration Act came forward, Dow AgroSciences is based in Indianapolis. That was a joint venture between Eli Lilly and Dow when it was originally formed, Dow Elanco. And our group there is very active, and they said, we're going to fight this battle. And they were first to sign on, and you know, they were right there with Lilly fighting that battle. And that was a very positive response that we got in Indiana. We did not have the same luck in Texas. We did not have the same luck in Louisiana. The morning that Jindal said he was going to come to the floor and argue about his own legislation in Louisiana. A busload of 11 Dow employees from Plaquemine showed up at Capitol Hill, and they were there to make our voice heard, say, that may be what you're going to do, but this isn't what Dow is all about. So we can make an individual difference. We're seeing it in Georgia right now with Salesforce. You've seen the CEO of Salesforce.com is out very actively saying, we don't support this, up to the point that we're actually going to think about, do we move headquarters if you change this law? So we can have a difference, and business needs to make a difference. Big businesses, the size of ours, can actually move the needle. I know a lot of small businesses think this is very difficult for us to do, and I can understand that. But big businesses have a right. We were very active in the amicus brief and very supportive on trying to get the work done there and get the signatures that were needed for that brief. So I don't think business should shy away. And I don't think it should just be folks like myself who are actively out. In the case of Louisiana, when that issue came up, it didn't come up from me or our CEO. It actually came up from our employees on the ground that said, this is an issue, this is what's right, and we're going to go fight it. And that, to me, was a sign that the culture had changed, is it didn't have to be driven from the top. It actually was a groundswell from the employees that decided we were going to take that issue.
Mary?
Yeah, and just two pieces about that. I mean, these briefs to the Supreme Court from the business community, one of the points that they argued was people are going to be holding themselves back when they're worried about discrimination. And I would just suggest that if you are in a state, there was this horrible situation that happened in the Midwest that some people may have heard about, where a 6-day-old baby with her lesbian moms, the pediatrician refused to see the kid because it was a same-sex couple. I mean, there's just more and more examples cropping up. And if you're in a state that passes one of these, First Amendment defense acts or religious refusal acts or whatever it might be, that gives you carte blanche to behave as you want to behave, basically, then you're going to be worried at work, and it's going to come into the workplace. So I'm going back to all those discussions about what makes people productive and so on. What happens outside of the workplace, especially when it's this vitriolic, is going to affect workplace productivity and so on. So that's one part of it. Another thing that these briefs argued that I completely agree with is that there's a way in which inconsistency, I think, among the states is really a hindrance. This is part of what got us onto the idea of filing a business brief in the DOMA context. Was we knew ourselves, I knew myself of employees in Massachusetts where their marriages were respected who didn't want to be transferred out of state because they didn't want to go to Texas and lose their marriage. And eventually, I think that whole idea of business saying it would be really helpful to us if we had some consistency across the board here. So I really think there's lots of ways to couch this, apart from it being, I think, the right thing to do, and apart from it just really being an historical moment for us. I know we'd all like to be done. We're not done, and we're not even done with marriage, because now we're dealing with the whole pushback on that and trying to whittle it away and create all kinds of new exceptions.
Okay, we're going to take some questions in the audience, but we've got one in from the app, which is for Victoria and maybe Mary. You have to follow the law, but obviously not all laws are just. If activist judges are bad, quotes, where is the line between believing in equal rights and being in a position of power to promote those rights?
Well, we have to follow. Well, each judge has to basically figure out for themselves where that line goes in terms of following the law. We're supposed to follow the law. And in general, the courts are a conservative institution. They're not, while a lot of people look to the courts, actually they look to the court, the U.S. Supreme Court, as though it's some great policy-making body. The truth of the matter is that each of our courts is just trying to interpret the laws for the jurisdiction it's operating under. And so you can say what's right, but the question is, what's the law on which you're going to be hanging that? And so I'm not going to go into the argument for each individual case, because that's actually what Mary does for a living. The courts, I'm sitting there, I'm looking at statutes, I'm looking at prior decisions that were made, and at a trial court level, certainly for us, we follow whatever's in front of us. I mean, I'm not going to sit there with each case and wonder, for example, whether or not I'm going to overturn something because I think that a higher court's misapplied the law. As a matter of fact, that would be considered inappropriate for me to do. And so I make the ruling according to the law that's given to me, and then that gets appealed to the next level, and it moves up the food chain to somebody who's in a higher position to be able to make those sorts of decisions. And so litigation is a useful tool for trying to enforce these rights, but I want to say that it's a conservative institution. It's going to move along, perhaps not as fast. The courts can't keep up with the world around us. And
So we heard about Colombia this morning, and I think where litigation was crucial, and the court seemed to have taken very interesting views on marriage, on family and children and so forth.
Well, I mean,
but that isn't our best bet here in the States.
Well, I'm just saying that not necessarily. I mean, we have a process, and the process it can be very useful to use for litigation, but it doesn't solve all of our problems. And as a judge, I'm at the trial court level. I follow what the law says, and unless I'm presented with an argument and some good law to base it on. Now we have, for example, in this matter, the U.S. Supreme Court spoken. I can hang my hat on some things that were said in that case, but this is why litigation is a continuing process, and it's an evolving process. And so,
Mary, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think we need every branch of government. We need to be winning and persuading people in each branch of government and with the all-important court of public opinion that we're right. And that's how you make lasting change. I don't think it's either or. It's about everything. And I think the other thing I want to say, I mean, I realize that I don't mean to be overly alarmist, but I am concerned, and it's part of why we keep winning, okay? Is when people are paying attention to the problems out there. But I do want to just say one thing, which is I think leadership is super important, and we've heard some examples of that. And in 1996, the chief diversity officer for IBM, which then became the largest corporation to extend domestic partnership benefits, was faced with a revolt from within, being heckled when announcing these benefits. And he started his presentation by talking about how LGBT IBMers were part of the company's success and productivity and bottom line. And then the heckling starts, and then he says, oh, okay, I get it. So this is a matter of principle. You're right. We should not hire those people. We should not give them benefits. We should not sell to them either. Well, it's a matter of principle, so we're going to lose some money. Which of you wants to be first to give up your job? And again, I'm just mentioning that because think about where domestic partnership is now, okay? Which is, I think we still need it, to tell you the truth, especially when you think about international climate. But think about how much things have changed. In 1996, The Economist had a cover that I still have. Let them wed. So again, I think that the trends are in the right direction, but I don't think the trends happen on their own. They only happen with lots of work, and that's why we so much need business being creative, productive, innovative, in all the ways that I think it can help in this and help businesses.
And I want to just throw in, from a point of view as my lawyer hat on here, it's important that we're having this sort of discussion about business case because truthfully, your lawyers will probably say, well, you have a fiduciary duty to your stakeholders, to your shareholders, to your partners, whatever, in order to maximize profits and you shouldn't be, they might question whether or not this is the best approach. You need to have a business case for why this is the best thing to do because, and you should have that in advance before you question later, why did you do this? Know why it is that you're doing this. And it's, I think, very valuable we're having this discussion.
So I'm going to have to apologize to the audience. We're almost out of time, and we haven't got time to take more of your questions. We have the one from the app. And normally we like to get lots of questions, but I want to get each panelist to finish with one specific challenge to this audience. I mean, given where we're at in America at the moment, where some progress, important, really significant progress on marriage, but serious backlash building. What I want each of you to challenge. Where do you think business should be focusing now? What's the next battleground, and what's the number one priority for action over the next 12 months or so, Jim?
Well, I think on non-discrimination, it's a big imperative for us. I think it helps us really set the playing field. If we had federal support and we didn't have to rely on this state-by-state patchwork, it would be a big improvement for us. And I think one of the ways that we have to do this from a business standpoint is with the people that can influence these decisions is we've always made progress on these things by making it personal. I think, the journey of so many people coming out over the years is what led us to domestic partner benefits. It's what led the title change and people being supportive of gay marriage. That wouldn't have happened without making it very, very personal and making it more open and more public, and we can do that as business.
Yeah?
My angle would be a global angle. I feel we have made so much progress in the US, much more to be done. But for our global associates and employees, I think there's much more to be done. So I really would love to see the focus on that.
Any particular places globally that you...
I think it depends on each company. In our case, I think India would be a great place to start, where a lot of US multinationals have big exposure, and I think corporations could make a big difference in that country, actually.
Mary?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and I would just say if we're going to go out there as a leader on global values and business, then we do have some cleaning up to do here at home to have some authenticity in saying that. We still don't have non-discrimination and meaningful protections for people in a lot of the country.
And last word to you, Victoria.
Last word, wow. What I would say is for businesses, I'm going to go with the trans angle because I'm going to be the transgender person you get to hear from today, is that hiring transgender people and putting us in positions of authority, positions where we interact with your partners, with your shareholders, with the other stakeholders in your various activities, I think would be both presents you well as will allow the world to see that who we are as trans people. I think one of the reasons that the lesbian gay community has been so successful in the United States is because people came to realize that we as lesbian gay people are just the same, just as boring as everybody else. We're just like you. And in a lot of ways in the transgender community, I think it's the same thing, but people haven't had a chance to get to know us yet. And so that I think people should see, trans accountants and lawyers and statisticians and all sorts of other things, and not just think that we all have reality TV shows or dance with stars or or working on street corners or something. And so anyway.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panel and. Great conversation. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Tom Standage for what I think will be an extremely interesting interview with John Brennan, the head of the CIA. So thank you very much.